So today we are talking about the question, can a Christian marry more than one person? And we did talk about some of this a little bit way back at the beginning of our mixed bag musings. It was question number 2, why are Christians so preoccupied with sex? But I think that marriage, while it has to do with sex, is not the same thing. And so this is an interesting and helpful, challenging question for us to approach. So away we go. Starting with our assumptions, I want to ask some questions about this question because we have, we make some assumptions about what it is we're even talking about when we talk about marriage. So the first question that I think we need to address is, what is marriage? And I think we'll find that marriage is a almost universal cultural component of all cultures. Not quite everyone does it, but it's pretty universal. But there are a variety of ways that marriage is understood, even within our own European kind of context and background. We've got different understandings of marriage. In some places, and some even within some denominations and within the church, marriage is understood to be a contract. It is, two people have decided that they are going to enter into this contract together and participate in the contract and upholding their end of the bargain. And that's not very romantic, but that's kind of the way it works sometimes. Or it's not just two individual people, but it's maybe two families or two groups of people. Martin Luther used the phrase social estate to talk about marriage. The social aspect being that we are engaging in a relationship, and that relationship affects our other relationships with other people in our society, and the estate part meaning that it is an established institution of the society that helps to keep everybody organized. And then there are some churches, most notably the Catholic Church, that believes that marriage is a sacrament. And by definition, at least in the Lutheran Church, a sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace. So being married means that you receive God's grace through the marriage, at least if the marriage is an appropriate and good one. So those are some different understandings of what marriage is, even within our own culture, let alone other cultures. Marriage often has to do with cultural norms around sex and family and how we connect with one another. And in order to kind of express to you and help you understand, that marriage, when we think about marriage and the assumptions that we make, are assumptions that we make and not just the way it is, I wanted to share a couple of different unique marriage practices that come from around the world. The first one is called Tibetan fraternal polyandry. And this is historically in Tibet, which is a province, an area that's near China. All of the sons in the family would marry the same woman. So it was one woman, and she was married to not just one of the sons, but all of the sons in the family that she married into. And the reason for this was that then all of their offspring would be half siblings to one another, and property ownership would be preserved. In Tibet, of course, there are a lot of mountains, and so there's not a lot of ground that is usable because you have all this really steep terrain. And so property is very important. And if you are establishing new families among all of your children, and so say, you own some property and you have 4 children, well, now you have to divide that property into 4 pieces, and that's not going to support those children and their families and their needs. And so if you develop this process by which there is only one family and all of the sons are married to the same woman, then you can keep all the property in one family, because then the sons of the next generation will also all marry the same woman, and then any daughters that are born of the union, maybe one or two of them might marry out to one of these other people's families of boys, but then other ones usually would become nuns in the Buddhist tradition, or establish their own households, usually in more populated areas, and kind of maintain singleness. This process, this practice was almost wiped out when the Chinese took over Tibet, but now, according to what I've read, it is actually coming back a little bit. The practice is becoming not, I wouldn't say popular again, but is a little bit more frequent than it used to be. Another example of an interesting and unique norm around marriage comes from another group of people that is connected to China. This is the Na people of the Yunnan province in southern China. Historically, they actually did not have a marriage practice. So we talked, I said that marriage is pretty much universal, but there are some exceptions, and this is one of them. There is no marriage in this, traditionally in this culture, in this group of people. Women and men can have as many partners as they wish. They can initiate their relationships in whatever way they want. And children who are born from these unions are raised solely by their female relatives. So if a woman becomes pregnant, most of the time she is not going to know by whom, because she has more than one partner at a time. And it's said that over the course of a lifetime, someone could have as many as 200 different partners. And so there are no fathers. There are just female family members that raise children. So your mother raises you, obviously, and then you have aunts that you are aware of, females, and then you have maybe some older brothers who are not out of the house yet, and then you have maybe your grandmother that is still part of that household. And so there's really it's incredibly, extremely matrilineal, to the point that you don't even know who your father is. Now this practice was mostly wiped out by the Chinese in the 1970s. They were incredibly strict about trying to get rid of this practice, to the point that they would actually withhold food rations from children who did not know who their father was, who could not provide proof of who their father was. And so this would prevent people from participating in this practice, because if you had a child that didn't know their father, then the child is going to starve. And so obviously you don't want that. And so you are more willing to give up your traditional practices and become monogamous in the way that the Chinese government wanted you to. They stopped all those harsh treatment in the 80s, and now are working to keep this practice infrequent, if not dissolve it entirely through education rather than through sanctions. But this is a unique type of understanding of marriage. So obviously I'm not suggesting that we do these things, but what I'm trying to get across is that our understanding of marriage is not the only way that marriage has been or could be understood. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're asking questions like, can a Christian marry more than one person? So any questions about that before we move on to the next thing? Okay. So the next thing in terms of assumptions that I think we need to explore a little bit before we jump into this question is not just what is marriage, but why? Why do we get married? What is the purpose of marriage? And I think, again, just like with the question of what is marriage, the purpose of marriage is, and the assumptions that we make about why we get married has to do with the culture. It depends on where we live and what the cultural norms are around it that we learn as we're growing up. In some places, the purpose of marriage is about the legal connection of families. Marriage is a legal and socially recognized connection between two families. It impacts their legal and social standing with one another in the society. It impacts the legal and social standing of any offspring. It impacts the legal and social standing of the spouses in the homes of their in-laws, things like that. So you might get married to connect families to avoid war, or to widen your power or widen your property holdings. You might marry or force your children to marry one another to maintain control over the lineage. You want your grandchildren to have the appropriate pedigree, and so you want your children to be married to appropriate people. You might engage in a marriage or have your children engage in a marriage to maintain control of your money or of your financial holdings. All of these things are sometimes involved in considerations about why people might get married. Additionally, we've got kind of not just the control portion in terms of the family that is involved or the individuals that are involved, but also the society. Marriage as an institution, as a cultural practice, helps the society to control people's behavior. It helps to control their sexual relationships, with whom they are engaging in sexual relationships. It helps to control procreation. Marriage, especially monogamous marriage, is a way to establish a monopoly over access to that person, and so that helps to control who is procreating with whom, and who has a relationship with whom, and who is in being influenced by whom. So we don't want our children to be gallivanting around and meeting people that are different from them and developing relationships with them, because what will become of them and what will become of my grandchildren if they end up falling in love and spending too much time together and having children. And so that is kind of part of it too. Of course, historically, when humans didn't understand how the reproductive process worked, there was a lot of fear around this seemingly magical power that women had to produce the next generation. We are animals, and so we have that biological and evolutionary instinct to procreate, but not understanding how that happens and why that happens. We know that women have that power and men do not. And so how do we make sure that we have control over that? How do we make sure that we know where our progeny is coming from? How do we make sure that we are the ones who are procreating and our enemies are not? The only way to do that is to control sexual access, and by doing so, we can maintain that control. But in order to do that, we have to limit the access to that person. And so we have these institutions, these norms, these practices that help us to accomplish that goal. But there are biological and evolutionary benefits. I don't think that marriage is just all about control and it's a terrible thing and nobody should get married. When we talk about marriage, I think it is usually a cultural practice that is designed to protect the offspring. We, like I said, are animals. We have this impulse to procreate and to make sure that our genes are passed on. And so we have this instinct too to protect our offspring, to make sure that they grow up to be able to procreate. And of course, now that we have larger brains, not just procreate, but have a nice life and succeed and be happy and have good relationships with their partners and with other people in society, and have everything that they need and not feel want. And so in order to fulfill that desire that we have for our offspring, we develop these cultural practices that support the best possibility for survival and thriving of that child. If the biological parents remain connected to one another past conception, and hopefully stay together through the birth of the child, through the raising of the child, then theoretically that should give the child a better shot at survival, at thriving in the world, whatever that looks like within your particular context. So, obviously that's a good thing that we have going for us as humans. And another, I think, biological and evolutionary benefit of marriage is that when you are married, you kind of maintain, develop and maintain at least a partial, if not a total monopoly over the benefits of your partner's domestic and other labor services. And by that, I mean that, if you're married to someone and they are out there working and making money, then the assumption is that you get to benefit from that money that comes in. Or, if you are staying home and taking care of the house and doing the cooking and cleaning and all those things, then the assumption is that your spouse is the person that will benefit from that labor and not someone else. And so in order, as partners, you have a better chance of surviving together, of thriving together, of making sure that your offspring survive and thrive together. And so you get married in order to kind of have that better shot at success in the world. So lots of different purposes here, right? Variety of reasons why people might get married. And these are all, pretty much from even within available and within our own context, let alone other cultural contexts. So I think that is all I have to say in terms of introduction. Any questions or comments about any of that? Very quiet tonight. Everybody's tired.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So this control of women, with what's going on today with all the controversy over abortion and the control of women's reproductive life, that seems like it shouldn't be today like it was back in Bible times, but it sounds to me like the same thing. Like what's going on now is, how do we control these women and what they're doing with their bodies? That's weird.
The more things change, the more they stay the same in some ways.
Well, it's just weird that I don't even know how it became how did it become a political issue in the first
Karen,
place?
you just asked the question of the day. So now that you asked it, I'm going to put it on the list. It's a very interesting story. I will be happy to share it with you. One of our more controversial topics, but I think I think it's a good question to talk about. I think we'll put that on the list.
Well, I'm interested in this evolution of marriage because I know that what's happened in the past, women have always been controlled, and that was one way that it happened. But anyway, okay, I'm done.
I will put that on the list. We will talk about that. Jen, did you have something? I saw your mouth moving, but I didn't hear you say anything.
It's a random question. It's just, my wandering mind. On the Tibetan practice of the woman marrying all of the brothers, what happened? You said the extra women sort of, some of them maybe go to the nunnery.
Yep.
But really, how does that keep things balanced? What do all the other women do? They just take care of the children, or what?
Yeah, what I read about it said that that the extra daughters that don't marry into these families of brothers become nuns, or they go off and they create their, establish their own households as single people, but and never marry, but they can't, they don't inherit the property of their family or anything like that. So it didn't say anything about what happens to them and how they how they survive, because they don't have property to use to, grow food, and they don't have any money or anything to go on. So yeah, I thought that was really, really bizarre. But that's what it said that they do with the extra girls, quote unquote, because if you've got, 4 brothers, then if everything is equal, otherwise equal, then you've got supposedly, 3 girls out there somewhere that don't have anybody to marry.
I know. It's crazy. I don't quite understand the math. Okay. Sorry.
That's all right. All right.
Diversion there.
So now we can start jumping into the question itself. So I want to start, of course, with the Bible, which is where we get our cultural norms as Christians, ideally. And surprise, surprise, we are going to be talking once again about hermeneutics. How do you read the Bible? What tools do you use? What assumptions do you make? Because this is, as always, critical to our understanding of what the Bible tells us, and therefore what God wants us to understand about a particular topic. So let's start out by looking at some passages related to marriage. First one that I want to bring up to you is Genesis chapter 2, verses 22 through 24. This is the passage that tells us supposedly where marriage comes from. It says, "The rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, 'This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh.'" So in the ancient world, the understanding was that in order to marry someone, you just slept with them. That was it. After you slept with them, you were married. There is no such thing as fornication in the Old Testament. There's no word for it because there's no such thing. As soon as you sleep with someone, that is your spouse. And after that, it's not fornication, it's adultery. And so adultery is the only thing that we talk about in terms of sexual behaviors that are unacceptable. And this is why. But who you can marry is a little bit, I think, loosey-gooseier. I'm going to read to you a couple different passages here. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 30, it says, "A man shall not marry his father's wife, thereby violating his father's rights." So it doesn't have any context about whether the father has died or is alive or what the situation is, but apparently one of the things that you cannot do is marry your father's wife, whether she is your mother or not. Can't do it. But there are other things that are okay to do, seemingly. In Genesis chapter 20, verse 12, we are in the middle of one of those stories where Abraham is traveling and he runs into some powerful king who takes a liking to his wife, Sarah, or at that time, Sarai. And in order to save his own skin from getting murdered so that they steal his wife from him, Abraham tells Sarah to tell this person, "Oh, he's my brother." And Abraham says, "Oh, well, I'm giving my excuses for why I told you this. She is actually indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife." So Sarah, according to this passage, is not just Abraham's wife, but is also his half sister. And this is just okay. It's accepted. He runs around telling people that this is his sister when it helps him, because she actually is his sister. He's not lying when he says that. He's just misrepresenting all of the truth by not mentioning that also she's my wife. And that seems to be an okay thing. Here's another good one. I think we missed this because it's kind of complicated. So this is Genesis chapter 11, and this is about the ancestry of Abraham, the family of Abraham. It says, "Now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram." So this is Abraham's father. "Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. So some of these names we know. We know Abram or Abraham, and we know Lot, his nephew, who will have something to do with the story later. Nahor and Haran, we don't really know them, but those are the brothers of Abram. And it says that Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. So Haran, who is the brother of Abram, is dead. Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. We know that one already. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. And so that, you kind of gloss over that because all these names don't really mean a whole lot to us. Only certain ones do. But if you look at this, I actually had to draw out a little family tree to figure this out and make sure that I understood. Milcah is married to Nahor, who is Abraham's brother. And who is Milcah? She's his niece. Haran, who was also a brother of Abram, is the father of this woman. And so Milcah is the niece of Nahor, who marries her. And this is just completely accepted too. Totally fine. In Exodus chapter 6, so this is not just an old Genesis thing, we've got some other people that have, random names that we're not familiar with. A guy named Amram married his aunt, Jochebed, and she bore him some pretty famous people, Aaron and Moses. So the father and mother of Moses were actually aunt and nephew, in addition to husband and wife. And this is just, these things are just thrown into these stories. It's not a big deal. It doesn't seem like there's really much in the way of incest worry and taboo. Maybe there's nothing about, direct siblings, full 100% siblings. So that's probably not okay. And the taboo, of course, of you can't marry your father's wife. But other than that, it seems like anything goes. And it really makes a lot of sense because in this time, it was important for you to maintain control and access to your property. You didn't really have land property so much as you had herds and wives and slaves and tents and things like that, so that you could travel around and find the pastures that were going to be best for your animals. But you didn't want to have to do a whole lot of dividing of those herds over the course of time, because you wouldn't then be able to thrive in the way that earlier generations had. And so it was very common to do things like run off to your uncle and marry your cousins, like somebody like Jacob did. So marriage norms, obviously very, very different in this time period. As we move forward and we get into our New Testament, we see that there are additional marriage norms that we can see evidence for. So this is Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 9. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, and to test him, they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh?' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" Jesus said to them, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. And he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So we've got norms about who you can marry. We've got norms about what happens after you're married and bad things happen. We've got norms about interpreting how marriage as an idea came about and why we get married. But I want to remind you here that hermeneutics are critical to us understanding what all of this stuff means and how we ought to interpret it and understand it. How we read the Bible matters, because if we just took these passages and we threw them out there and we said, here they are on the face of them, no context, here's the passage that is relevant to this situation, then the answer to this question is, well, you can't get divorced, and you can't marry someone who's been divorced, but you can marry as many other people as you want, as long as you're a man. You can marry as many women as you want at any given time. And you can marry your half sister, you can marry your aunt, you can marry your niece. All of these things are fine. That's what we would have to say the answer to this question is. But I don't think that that's right. I don't think that that is the answer to this question. And the reason for that is because of how I read the Bible, my hermeneutic. So any questions about that before we move on? Or comments? No. Okay. So I want to take a pause from our Bible conversation and our hermeneutical conversation and talk a little bit about marriage norms in what I call the cultural West. So we call ourselves the West, or the developed world, or first world countries, or whatever you want to call it. But people like Americans, people like Europeans, that kind of fall into the cultural mindset that we all share with each other. What are some things that we have going on that we kind of all assume? For the most part, it's monogamy. There is very little tolerance for polygamy in our modern world, which is very different, obviously, from the biblical norm that we see with marrying lots of different women and not really being bothered by that. In our wider culture today, you see that there is kind of an opening tolerance for what people call open marriages or polyamory, loving more than one person. This is becoming more common in our wider culture. But still, generally speaking, we've got this idea that monogamy is kind of the norm, the way that we have to go. One person married to one other person. We also now have the idea that we are kind of making a voluntary legal covenant with our partner, and that legal covenant recognizes an emotional connection. Before, there wasn't really much in the way of that emotional connection or need, because marriage was not about loving somebody. Marriage was about convenience. Marriage was about political maneuvering. Marriage was about survival in a lot of situations. We needed each other in order to make sure that we could dig up enough potatoes to feed ourselves and feed our family. And so we got married. Now we don't really have those needs anymore. And so it can be about who we want to be with and who we don't want to be with. And because of that, it's much easier to break that legal contract. Well, if it's about emotion and emotional connection, and that emotional connection is not there anymore, then we really have no reason to maintain that relationship. And so we break that contract and move on with our lives. And that obviously over the course of time has become more and more common and more accepted. I read a couple different stats this week. It said that upwards of 46% of marriages in the United States end in divorce today. And so that's, it's fairly common and fairly accepted culturally to make those breaks, and not a big deal. There have been a lot of changes too over the course of time in terms of what happens when a divorce takes place. It used to be that that custody of children was given to whichever parent had greater financial means. Children were handed over to the parent that could pay for the most stuff for them. And that the person that had the most financial means was responsible for spousal support. Usually, of course, that was assumed to be the man needing to take care of the previous wife after the divorce. But now things really have changed a lot. It's more based on what's going to be best for the child in terms of the parental custody. There has been some kind of equalization in terms of the spousal support assumptions after divorce. There's not really that assumption that you need to do that anymore. But if there is, then it's a little bit more equal in terms of the gender roles in that. And it's not just the man is responsible for taking care of this woman that he previously was married to. It's not just that anymore. It can be the other way around too, if that's what works out. I think there are also changing expectations in terms of why we get married, and why we might not get married, or who we can marry, all those types of things. We marry for mutual love, like I said, rather than economic necessity or by arranged marriage for political or economic reasons. Singleness is increasingly legitimized and allowable, not just widowhood or something like that, but lifelong singleness is something that is more and more accepted. Nobody really uses the word spinster so much anymore, which I think is a good thing. And that's really even been in my lifetime, that has changed a whole lot. My second grade teacher, I will never forget, was this little old lady who had been taking care of her mother her entire life. Her father died when she was very young, or not even before she was born. And so she spent her entire life taking care of her mother, and her mother lived well into her 90s. And so she was quite elderly, even by the time her mother died. I think she was pushing 80 by the time her mother died. And so she never married. And people called her a spinster. People called her all kinds of stuff. And that kind of stuff just isn't acceptable anymore for the most part. I don't think we use words like that. We just let people be what they are and do what they're going to do. She just wasn't interested in that, and that's okay. That kind of thing, I think, is becoming more common. In terms of who you can marry, certainly there was a time when interracial marriage was not only looked down upon but actually illegal, and that's no longer the case in most circumstances. Women's rights within marriages have changed, obviously. It is no longer legal to abuse your spouse, in either direction. Property that is acquired during the marriage is considered to be jointly owned. So if there is a divorce or a separation, that asset needs to be split between the two as equal partners, those types of things. But we do still have this sense of monogamy as the most important element of our marriages in the cultural West. Whether you're married or not, there is an expectation of faithfulness to the one person that you're in a relationship with until that relationship ends. And like I said before, there is a little bit of openness to that, the open marriage thing, the seeing other people type of model. But there's just this assumption in our culture that kind of thing can't work long term, that there's something inherently necessary in terms of faithfulness in a relationship that cannot be maintained if there is another person involved in that relationship. And we still have that kind of cultural assumption within our culture today. So any comments or questions about any of those other things that I missed that you think are important to bring up? Okay.
So when and where were the laws made about not marrying within your family? Is that just a Western belief, or we passed all these laws, you can't marry your cousin and so on and so forth?
Well, those types of things are actually fairly new. We have evidence of the you can't marry your own mother or your father's spouse. That's pretty old. We've got stories like the story of Oedipus Rex. His major sin was that he married his own mother, right? And that was what caused his downfall in that Greek tragedy. So there's there's always been some kind of taboo in terms of incest, but who counts as an incestuous relationship has changed a lot over the course of time, and not just within Western culture, but across the board. You know, even today in the American South, there are cultures and communities where they don't understand what the problem is with marrying your cousin. That's just kind of something that is acceptable and okay to do, and in fact desirable, because it keeps people within the family and keeps property within the family. And of course, you have a lot of common beliefs, and you share on an upbringing. You might have grown up together, so you know each other really well, those types of things. So they make this argument that, what's the problem with marrying my cousin? But I think the more we understand about about science, about genetics, about how incest can affect the offspring and their the genetic pool, I think we expand that further and further out, so that it's not just don't violate the rights of your father by marrying your mother or your not non-mother, your stepmother or something, but that you shouldn't marry certain degrees of cousins and things like that because of the connection there. But it takes time for these norms to catch up, even with the scientific discoveries.
Okay.
Did any of you have to go and get a blood test before you were allowed to get married? Were you part of that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. What about serial monogamy? I'm not sure I'm clear on that.
So that is a term that just means that you are in a committed relationship, but you have it with multiple people over the course of time. So I am committed to this person, and then I break up with that person, then I'm committed to the next person, and I break up with that person, then I'm committed to the next person, and I break up with that person. And whether you are married to that person and then you divorce and marry somebody else and divorce, or if it's a little bit less formal in terms of the legality of it, that's serial monogamy, that you're in one relationship with one person at a time, but then you do multiple relationships over the course of your life. Versus with bigamy, you have multiple partners at the same time. And in our society, there is kind of this understanding that that is inappropriate, that it's not right to have more than one partner at a time. But that it's okay to have full faithfulness to one person, break up, and then move on to the next person.
Okay.
All right. So where I want to go next is I want to talk to you about when it all changed. We talked about what the Bible assumes about marriage and who you can marry and how many people you can be married to at once. And then we talked a little bit about where we are today and what we assume is okay and not okay. When did it all change? How did we go from what the Bible says to what we are working with today? And I want to start that conversation with our friend, Saint Augustine of Hippo. He was in the turn of the century into the 400s. And he wanted to discourage polygamy. He thought that it was a practice that was heathenistic and barbaric and troubling and troublesome to the stability of his culture. And so he would discourage it. And he wrote this statement about polygamy. He said, polygamy was lawful among the ancient fathers. This is our Bible, right? All of these Jacobs and Abrahams and all these people had multiple wives. It was lawful among the ancient fathers. Whether it be lawful now also, I would not hastily pronounce. For there is now not necessity of begetting children, as there then was, when even when wives bear children, it was allowed, in order to a more numerous posterity, to marry other wives in addition, which now is certainly not lawful. So the translator of that was clearly trying to make him sound old Englishy, because he's got all kinds of weird syntax and grammar in there. But basically what Augustine is trying to say here is, back then it was necessary for men to marry more than one person, because we needed more children. We needed those children to work. We needed them to survive because they didn't survive past, past their infancy nearly as often as they did even by the time you got to the year 400. You had more of an urban organization, and especially where Augustine was, he lived in the city, and so he didn't understand, the importance of having lots and lots of children to help at the farming and all those types of things. And so he's suggesting that the reason why polygamy was allowed in ancient times with the Bible fathers was because they needed all those extra kids to be born all the time so that they could survive. And in his time, it wasn't needed anymore, and therefore should not be done. It is now unlawful to marry more than one person at a time. And St. Augustine's letters were extremely popular, even among people who did not consider themselves to be Christians, and therefore he was very influential. And so he did a really good job of tamping down the practice of polygamy within his sphere of influence, because people listened to him, and he said, no, this is not okay to do. And so people kind of stopped doing it. About 100 years later, in the year 534, the Emperor Justinian, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire at the time, published what is called the Codex Justinianus. And one of the laws that he published in his codex, in his list of laws, was that sexual relationships outside of a monogamous marriage is illegal. So this is now, it's not just not great to be married to more than one person. It is now illegal in terms of the law of the land, that if you want to be married to more than one person. And this codex, Justinianus, very difficult to say that word, Justinianus, actually served as the basis of European law for about 1,000 years. So it was incredibly influential for a really, really long time. And so this assumption that monogamous marriage is really the only way to go has a lot to do actually with Justinian. He's the one that started this whole thing, at least in terms of the legality of bigamy or polyamorous relationships. He put it into the law of the land, and it stayed that way for at least 1,000 years. So 1,000 years later, we run into the Council of Trent in 1563. And so now we're looking at the church, right? So Justinian, of course, is a political leader, not necessarily a religious leader, but back then that didn't really matter because they were, kind of one and the same thing. Justinian was a Christian leader, and he had laws that were based on Christianity. But in 1563, the Catholic Church had this council at Trent. It's called the Council of Trent, obviously. And they needed to work out some details. And if you look at the year here, 1563, you might suspect that this had something to do with an annoying little man named Martin Luther, who caused all kinds of problems for a lot of people. And you would be right. The Council of Trent was part of the Counter-Reformation, the response to the Reformation. The Catholic Church's understanding of what really should be going on, as opposed to these people who are doing all the wrong things. And so they said a lot of things about a lot of different topics. They talked about a lot of the things that Luther was talking about. They just had their own opinions about what it meant. They talked about communion and how it should not be understood to just be symbolic, but it is the real, literal presence of God and of Christ in the bread and wine. They talked about what makes somebody a legitimate Catholic or not. But one of the interesting things that they brought up was related to marriage, because they said that a marriage is only valid if there is a priest and 2 witnesses present. So what does that do socially to these groups of people who are converting to Lutheranism or Calvinism or Zwingliism. Well, now, according to the Catholic Church, they cannot marry each other legally because a marriage is only valid if there's a priest present. And of course, Martin Luther, not a priest. He got excommunicated. He's not a legitimate priest. And so their marriages are not legitimate. If you are not legitimately married, then according to the Codex Justinianus, your sexual relationship is illegal and you can be punished for that. If you are not married in front of a priest, then your children are not considered to be socially legitimate. They are bastards. They have no legal standing in society. And so you can see that this is probably not some people being just very concerned that we maintain marriage properly, but is in fact an attempt to undermine these new movements and make life really difficult for them. Because if they can't marry each other, if they can't have legal standing in their relationships and with their families, and if their children have no legal standing, then they can't trade, they can't go to, they can't engage in the social and economic life of their community. And so that puts a lot of pressure on them to give up on this whole Reformation thing and just come back to the church. So I would say that this is much more about attempting to force people's hands and have them come back to the Catholic Church, even though they don't agree with it, than it has to do with marriage in and of itself. But even though that's the case, this Council of Trent declaration about marriage really changed our understanding of how marriage works. Before this, there was no expectation that a priest be present. You could just say, I marry you, and now you're married. But then now all of a sudden we've got this whole norm that develops around needing to have some kind of officiant who has legal standing to have a legal marriage, which of course we still have going on today, even though it doesn't have to be someone of clergy. It has to still be somebody who has legal standing to marry you. At the same time, they talked about divorce as well in this Council of Trent. They said that once you are married by a priest, with a priest present, you can separate from each other, but your marriage remains legal until one of the spouses dies. And that applies even if that spouse committed adultery, which is even harsher than what the Bible tells us, because we just read before that Jesus talked about how if there is adultery, if there's unfaithfulness in the relationship, then divorce is okay. And that's pretty much to him the only reason why divorce would be okay. But they say, no, not even that. It doesn't matter, what happened in the relationship until your spouse is dead, you are stuck being married to that person and you cannot marry somebody else legally. And of course, if you're having extramarital relations, that's illegal too. And so you're gonna get arrested, and who knows what will happen to you after that, depending on who's in charge. So you can kind of see how cultural assumptions and economic and social needs and the ethics and morals of a society that kind of are assumed all have an influence on how we understand marriage and the rules that we set around marriage and the cultural norms that grow up around marriage. How our community navigates what will work best depends on what they're trying to get to work best. What are the goals of our society? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Do we want social and economic stability? Do we want well-adjusted children? Do we want each of our individual members to feel free to live however they want to? Are there certain ways in which we need to limit people's freedom in order to maintain some sense of ethics and morals within our society? All of these are questions that individuals who are members of a society are asking all the time in the decisions that they make without even realizing it. But when we think about, what our how we should understand, whether somebody can do something. All of this is wrapped up into that in how we understand that. So any comments on any of that history? Okay. Moving right along then. So now we're getting closer to the question itself about can a Christian marry more than one person? And I want to talk to you about some possible circumstances related to a second marriage and what the Bible says about those. And we've talked about these already, but I just want to bring up a few more passages that might help to shed some light. So the first possibility, if there is going to be a second marriage, is polygamy. The first spouse is still alive and well, and I don't want to give them up. I still want to be married to them, but now all of a sudden I want to marry somebody else. Well, can I do that? Is that possible? So I want to talk to you about Exodus chapter 21 and then also Deuteronomy chapter 22. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. So Exodus chapter 21 says, if a man takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out without debt, without payment of money. So there is an expectation that, yes, a man is allowed to marry as many people as he wants, but we need to protect the women or the woman or women to whom he is already married. He cannot withhold her provisions. He cannot withhold marital rights, which means, her desire to have children. He can't say, well, I don't like you. I don't want to have children with you. Because for her, having children is not just kind of a meaningful maternal thing. That's how she protects herself. That's how she maintains her social standing in the society, particularly if her husband dies. If she doesn't have a son to give her social standing, she has nothing. She's all alone, completely abandoned, and has no way to make any money or find a way to support herself. And so a man is not allowed to have bring in a second wife to replace the first one. He has to maintain his relationship with the first one. And what happens if he doesn't? She's allowed to leave him, and without any consequences. She can go back to her family and maybe start over, find a different man who will be willing to do right by her in some way. Deuteronomy chapter 22 gives us a little bit more information about polygamy. It says, if a man is discovered lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman as well as the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. If there is a young woman, a virgin already engaged to be married, and a man meets her in the town and lies with her, you shall bring both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she did not cry for help in the town, and the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So men, totally fine for you to marry as many people as you want, as long as you don't take away their provisions and their rights. But women, definitely not. One husband, one situation, nothing else. Even if it is somebody who's engaged, the understanding is that that woman belongs to that man to whom she is engaged. And if a man lies with her in town and someone could have potentially hurt her, clearly she did not cry out, and so she is at fault too, and she should die, and you should die too, because you committed adultery. You violated the rights of this other man because his wife belongs to him. So that's what we've got going on with polygamy. Obviously, we don't really believe, or at least practice, any of this stuff anymore in our society with our cultural norms. And so, what do we do with that as we're trying to answer this question? I think that's something important for us to keep in mind as we move toward the answering our question. A second circumstance that might result in a second marriage is not that you want to marry somebody else at the same time as your first spouse, but that your spouse dies and you might be interested in remarrying and in finding a second relationship. So I have a couple of passages about this for you as well. So this is Genesis chapter 38. And this is a really interesting story. This is one of the stories that is not very well known at all in our Bible. It's one that I find very fascinating, that tells us a lot about cultural norms in the ancient world. It talks about Judah, who of course was the eldest son of Jacob, and the son from whom Judea, the people of Judah and Judea come from. So he's kind of an important founding figure. And this is a story that kind of goes along with that story that we hear in the Gospels, where the Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus in relationship to the resurrection and asked him about, if a woman's husband dies and there are no children, then she marries the next brother and then he dies, and the next brother and he dies, and the next brother and he dies, and there are no children. This is actually that story in real life. So I'm going to read this story to you. So Genesis chapter 38. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. So he's finding a wife for his son, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, his other son, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." So the understanding here, you notice, is not that this child is going to belong to the brother who impregnated her. This child is going to belong to the brother, to the dead brother. And it says, "But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his seed on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and God put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, 'Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up,' for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house." So the story goes on, and there are other contexts in which I'm sure we can bring up that story, but it's not really relevant right now. But the point for us today is that there are cultural norms related to the death of a spouse that are different in the ancient world, in the biblical world, versus what we understand to be the case now. The second marriage is not for the purpose of, happiness or continued, life success and thriving for either spouse. The purpose of the second marriage is to produce offspring for the deceased person. And this is the obligation of the brother of that person. And so again, kind of, an expression of our lack of understanding at this time period of, where do babies come from is kind of a big question that they have no idea about. But they do understand that they come out of women after they engage in sexual relationships with a man. And so they're trying to figure out how this works and how does a man produce a child. And it's important to produce a child because is the firstborn of Judah, who is also the firstborn. And so there's a lot going on here in terms of property rights and in terms of lineage and legitimacy. And then of course there's a lot at stake for Tamar, because if she doesn't have a son to protect her as she grows older, then she's going to be all alone in the world and have nobody to take care of her. So all of these things are wrapped up in this story. But there is, this element of not wanting to fulfill this duty. And then we get kind of just a statement of how things are in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Of course, this is a totally different cultural context than the first story, even though it's still in the Bible. It says, "A wife is bound as long as her husband lives. But if the husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord." So this is the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthians, and he says that there's no such thing as divorce. If you want to leave your spouse, go ahead and do it. But you are stuck being married to that person until the husband dies. And at that time, you can marry anyone you wish, but that person should be a Christian because you don't want to be unequally yoked. Oh, that's what that only in the Lord part means. So this expectation that, you know, you're not going to marry the brother of your deceased husband. You can marry whoever you want, but only after that person is dead. You can't divorce according to Paul. So a third circumstance in which a second marriage might be desirable, of course, is divorce. And I want to bring up this very this position of, you know, that Jesus, like, these are the words that came out of Jesus' mouth in relationship to this. This is from Matthew chapter 5. Jesus said, "It has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, this passage is, you know, kind of the crux of the relationship of Christians to the idea of divorce, and has caused a lot of pain for a lot of people over the course of a long time. I've shared on here before that my own parents, my mother and stepfather, believe that their relationship is sinful. They do it anyway because they love each other and support one another and felt like they couldn't not be married to one another, and so they're married. But you know, there are consequences to that for them personally and within the church that they choose to worship in terms of what they are and are not allowed to do as leaders in the church because of this passage. But I wanted to share with you how hermeneutics works, because a lot of people who believe that there is one way to read the Bible think that people who are, you know, from their perspectives more liberal, are just, you know, ignoring what the Bible is saying, or, you know, dismissing what the Bible is saying. But that's not actually the case. So I want to share with you a really important process that was engaged in by the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which is where I got my education theologically. So I'm very influenced by the PCUSA. And within the PCUSA, one of the sources of their interpretation and understanding of the Bible is called the Westminster Confession. Came from Westminster. That's why it's called that. And it's really long and wordy, and, you know, has all that old Englishy stuff in it. But in chapter 29 of the Westminster Confession, it says, "Although the corruption of man be such as is apt to study arguments unduly to put asunder those whom God hath joined together in marriage, yet nothing but adultery or such willful desertion as can no way be remedied by the church or civil magistrate is cause sufficient of dissolving the bonds of marriage." So again, lots of flowery, old Englishy language. What they're saying is humans are sinful, and we understand that. But we also know that in the Bible, Jesus tells us that nothing but adultery or willful desertion should dissolve the bonds of marriage, because that's what Jesus said. And what the Presbyterian Church did was they brought together a group of people to study this and to try to understand how not only this passage from Matthew, but also this passage of the Westminster Confession that establishes kind of the way that the Presbyterian Church organizes and runs itself. How do we understand this? You know, what do we do with this in the face of a world that is changing, in the face of a world where we now understand that, you know, women should not stay in relationships where they are being abused, or men should not stay in relationships where they're being abused, where, you know, where people feel like their lives are just completely wasted because they are with this person that they, you know, should not be with. That for people who grow up and find that they have grown apart from one another and could be much more, you know, fruitful and fulfilling in their lives and in the way that they engage with society if they weren't together with one another. We understand that all of these things happen in real life. And, like Westminster Confession said, because of human sin, because of our lack of full communion and connection to one another, because of our sinfulness, we know that this stuff exists. And so how do we deal with it in a way that is meaningful for our people within our denomination? And this group came up with a particular interpretation. And they didn't just say, like a lot of people who disagree with this kind of reading, they didn't just say, well, we're just going to ignore Matthew chapter 5. They said, what does it mean that Jesus said that the exception is on the grounds of sexual immorality, of unfaithfulness in the marriage? And they said that they used a particular passage from a different part of the Bible, which is a completely legitimate way of interpreting the Bible, allowing the Bible to interpret itself, right? Different parts can help to shed light on other parts. And this is from 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6. It says, "For the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life." And so they said, based on this interpretation, taking 2 Corinthians and laying it over top of Matthew chapter 5, they said that the letter of the law here is, our assumption of physical adultery. Sleeping with someone else is the only reason why you should be able to get divorced. But they said, if we are supposed to be reading these passages with the spirit and not with the letter of the law in mind, then actually what this is telling us is that Jesus is talking about infidelity. But infidelity is not just physical infidelity. They said anything that kills love and deals death to the spirit of the union is infidelity. And so they said that, yes, the only legitimate reason for divorce is unfaithfulness. But unfaithfulness is not just having sex with somebody else. You need to be faithful to the needs of the person that you're in the relationship with. You need to be faithful to the relationship itself and to making sure that that relationship is healthy and growing in a positive way. And if you're not doing that, then you are committing adultery in this spiritual way. You are being unfaithful to the relationship, maybe not physically, but emotionally.
Mm.
And so this is kind of how they came down on understanding this. They said, we don't need to change the Westminster wording. The Westminster wording is fine. It tells us that the only reason why you can get divorced is because of infidelity. But what we have to change is how we understand infidelity, not because we're looking for an out, not because we're looking for wiggle room, not because we're looking to legitimize our cultural practices that are, that God is unhappy with, but because we know that there is deep suffering happening out there because of this very rigid interpretation of this passage. And if we read with the spirit of the law, with the spirit of God in mind, and not the letter of the law, not reading from a literal perspective, then what we can see is that we are looking at something that is bigger and deeper than just physical infidelity. And so as this conversation continued, a later group of people that got together said that remarriage after a divorce granted on the grounds explicitly stated in scripture or implicit in the gospel of Christ may be sanctioned in keeping with his redemptive gospel. So what they're saying is that that they believed that you can remarry after divorce and remain faithful to the gospel of Christ, because Jesus said that divorce is okay on the basis of infidelity. and what is infidelity, it's much bigger than this very narrow understanding that we've had for all these years. So coming back around, can a Christian marry more than one person? I think that when we're thinking about this question, I think that this thing that the Presbyterian Church did is essential. Fidelity is essential for relationships to be maintained. All of the reasons that we've talked about for why people get married are based in fidelity. Children are not going to benefit from the maintenance of a relationship past conception unless the people that are in that relationship are faithful to one another. We have to be faithful in our relationships, to the feelings of the people in the relationships. We have to ask, what is life-giving for this relationship and the people that are in it? What supports the best upbringing for any offspring that are produced from this relationship? And sometimes the answers to these questions are difficult. You know, sometimes faithfulness to our relationships and faithfulness to one another and faithfulness to our children means being honest with each other and looking each other in the face and saying, I can't live with you. I can't be in this relationship with you anymore. When I was a teenager, I got really, really frustrated with my mom one night. I was tired of having to go over to my dad's on Tuesday nights and waste my time when I wanted to be with my friends instead, but that was what the court had said, and so I had to do it. And so I yelled at her and I said, why did you divorce my dad? You ruined my life. You know, these horrible things that teenagers say to their parents. And she said, I want you to think about what your life would have been like if I had stayed with your dad. Because my dad was incredibly, he was just wanted to stay home all the time. He never wanted to take us anywhere. He complained about money all the time and thought that vacations were a waste of money and a waste of time. We never would have gone anywhere. We never would have had any experiences. We never would have been able to, you know, get the toys that we wanted and any of those types of things that, you know, help a childhood be joyful. And so what my mom was saying to me in that moment, which I did not understand at the time, but do understand now, is that she made that decision for us just as much as she did for herself, maybe if not more. And I think that sometimes, you know, sometimes the answers to these questions about what's going to best support the offspring, what's going to be life-giving for this relationship is that tough decision. Sometimes we're not looking for the best option. Sometimes we're looking at the best of bad options in a situation because, you know, because we live in a world of sin, because we are people who are affected by sin. But we have to try to navigate the circumstances that we find ourselves in with grace and wisdom and treat each other and ourselves with the grace and wisdom that God gives us. And so I think that this, you know, this idea that fidelity is essential, this applies to everything. This applies to anybody today who wants to engage in one of these polyamorous relationships that, you know, is becoming popular. If that's what's life-giving in your relationship, if all 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 partners in the relationship are legitimately okay with this and are finding life in the way that the relationship is set up, then I think that God is okay with that. I think that what gives life to a relationship that needs to result in divorce is okay with God. God understands that this is kind of the process of us moving through our lives and growing and changing and becoming the people that God wants us to be. And staying in a relationship in which there is infidelity to the relationship in some way is not what God intends for us. God intends for us to have life and have it to the fullest. And so I think that applies to relationships after the death of one of the spouses. If remarrying is what's going to bring life to the person that remains, then I think that's great. If remaining single for the rest of their life is what's going to bring life to them and they can find other ways to have relationships and they want to continue to honor that spouse that they've lost because of their love for that person, and maintain that fidelity in that way, then I think that's okay too. But I think we have to all think about, what is going to be life-giving, what is going to show fidelity to this relationship and to all of my relationships, including my relationship with myself and my God. And the answers to those questions are not always easy, and sometimes sometimes cause pain, because we are fallen and broken people. So what I bring to you tonight as we wrap up is John chapter 13, verses 34 to 35. I give you a new commandment that is not new in any way. I don't know why Jesus said that it was new. That you love one another, just as I have loved you, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about this, can a Christian marry more than one person, is what does love look like in this situation? And sometimes, as people who are observing from the outside, we don't know. We don't know. But hopefully the people who are in the relationship and are trying to be faithful Christians as they navigate the complexity and messiness of being in a human relationship, they can focus on what's important, focus on fidelity to the relationship, focus on fidelity to the humanity of the other person, focus on their fidelity to the humanity of themselves, which I think a lot of times we don't think about. And think about, what does love look like in this situation? Sometimes love looks like divorce. Sometimes love looks like remarrying after you've lost somebody, in divorce or to death or something like that. Sometimes love looks like taking your children and leaving a bad situation because there are circumstances that you can't control, because the person that you're with is not being faithful to their relationship with you and to their relationship with your children. And all of those things, I think, are part of what it means to be human, and God is right there with those people. So for once, I'm answering the question, and I'm answering it fully. I say yes, a Christian can marry more than one person. Write that down. Natalia wasn't here to hear me answer a question.
I was just going to say that. And the 1 week Natalia is not here.
She always yells at me because I won't answer the questions, and this week I did. So that's what I have for this week's question. Any questions, comments, disagreements, agreements for me and for the sake of the group?
So I just had a question. I probably just need a little more concrete understanding of what, fidelity is essential, but so infidelity would be like maybe emotional abuse or abandonment, or neglecting the children, or maybe they're not a believer, maybe they don't believe in, they're not, the couple's not on the same page with, they're walking with the Lord. Are those, is that the line of thinking?
Yeah, sort of. I think what it comes down to for me is, am I committed to this relationship? Am I committed to this person? Am I showing love to this person by legitimizing their concerns, by considering their needs? When it comes to the non-believer thing, I think that it's possible to have a relationship with, a legitimate, faithful relationship with someone who is not a Christian. And Paul tells us that we shouldn't just automatically divorce each other if we become Christians. But I think what we have to do is, say to ourselves, how can I honor where this person is in their life and the needs that they have without harming myself, or without being, dishonoring my needs as well. How do we navigate that together? And if we are willing to continue to navigate that together, and both of us are committed and showing that commitment through their actions and behaviors and feelings, then I think that is, that's kind of that, we can get through anything together if we do that. But if one of the partners is not fully committed to that and is more interested in doing their own thing and doesn't feel like they have any emotional investment in supporting the other partner in the relationship, then I think that is where the infidelity starts to come in, not because of any particular thing that they've done, but because of their lack of commitment to that relationship. It's, the fidelity isn't even necessarily to the person, it's to the relationship itself. Am I being faithful in my upkeep of this relationship? And if I'm not, then why am I in it? And why am I harming this other person?
Gotcha.
Because I'm just lazy or afraid of change or, whatever it is.
Thank you. That clears that up. Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Thank you. That's a good explanation.
It's my vote too.
Yay.
All right.
Good. We did it.
So nobody angry with me? Nobody want to get out their
No.
pitchfork and tell me that
No.
divorce is wrong? Or
No,
No,
Yeah,
I
I
like how
figured-
the bridge was gapped
yeah,
between.
I've kind of weeded those people out of the class with some of the wacky things I've said so far in this class before.
No,
All right, well,
I think
Natalia,
that-
I hope that you come back and listen to this class. And then you can send me a text message and tell me what you thought, because I'm sure you have thoughts.
We'll testify to the fact that you
Yes, and I have all these witnesses
gave a clear
that I
answer.
answered a question for once and you just missed it. All right, so next week and the week after that, I will not be in the country. Penny and Linda Ruby and I are going to El Salvador to represent our church in our sister parish, developing sister parish relationship between our synod and the El Salvadoran Lutheran Church. And so we will be doing that for the next 2 weeks. And so our next class will be on November 17th. And our question for that day is, how do children experience faith? Which I'm very excited about. I have a whole book. I'm going to read it to you. It'll take hours. I will summarize
We've
it to
got
you.
2 weeks. Why don't you tell us what to read?
So the book that I'm going to base it on is by James Fowler, and it's called Stages of Faith. So if you're bored and want to go to the library or go online and order a copy and read the whole thing, it's very scholarly, but it's super helpful and super interesting. And if you're interested in understanding children and the way that their faith develops, and if you don't want to read it, I will summarize it for you and tell you what I think of it in 2 weeks. 3
Okay.
weeks, actually.
When are you leaving for your trip?
We're leaving next Thursday, and so I'll be in the air when we are supposed to have our class, and then we're coming back the following Friday.
Katie, could you text me the Fowler's name and all that, please?
Sure, I will do that.
Thanks.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. Hope you have a wonderful couple of weeks and take care of yourselves. I'll see a few of you on Sunday and a few of you next time we get together.
Bye. Have a good time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good
Good
night,
trip.
everyone. Good
Good
night.
night.
Thank
Bye.
you. Great class.
Bye, Katie. Bye, Katie.